I'm really excited about this next session. One of our speakers is running a little bit behind, so she will be joining us during the session. But in the meantime, I would like to introduce you to Ridhi Shetty. She is a policy counsel for the Center for Democracy and Technology. She has an expertise in privacy and data, as well as justice issues. So as I said, what Surya was talking about after his last, as an answer to Teddy in the last session, is really kind of a perfect segue into this one. So I guess I will just let you take it off, and we'll welcome Wilmari when she arrives. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Hi, everyone. Guessing everybody can hear me. Great to meet all of you. As Anne mentioned, I'm Ridhi Shetty, and I work particularly on issues of data-driven discrimination and how they can affect marginalized communities across different sectors that affect access to critical opportunities. So I'm going to focus on a variety of different private sector practices, especially concerned about that involve the use of biometric and behavioral data in a variety of different ways. So first I would like to talk about is in the health context. Facial analysis has been used for clinical diagnosis. So for instance, to diagnose pain for people who are nonverbal or who otherwise are unable to articulate their pain, or to, for instance, diagnose autism by analyzing facial expressions and repetitive behaviors. Clinical practices apply diagnostic standards based on these presumptions about how and among whom certain medical conditions present, which are really influenced by a history of medical discrimination, especially racism in the practice of medicine. And so these diagnostic standards then in turn influence the training data that is used to develop clinical diagnosis tools. And as Dr. Joy Bolamwini and Dr. Tim Gebru's gender shade studies shows, facial analysis can produce higher error rates for darker skin tones and based on gender when it's trained on data sets that mainly represent faces of white people assigned male at birth who so identify as masculine. And then there's another study by the Journal of the American Medical Association that found that image-based diagnostic algorithms are disproportionately trained on data from only 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. So that really underrepresents then the various communities' needs across the country. So when data sets are derived from people who have had access to correct diagnosis and appropriate treatment in the past, people whose needs are not and have historically not been met are less likely to receive the correct diagnosis and care that they need. And marginalization based on racial and gender norms can affect how the same disabilities also can present, and how they're perceived and how they're masked. So people of color, transgender and gender nonconforming people, and girls and women are less likely to receive accurate diagnosis, and disabilities that affect facial features, bone structure, or mobility will also affect the accuracy of facial analysis. So all these issues are critical because formal diagnosis is often a gatekeeper for accessing school and workplace accommodations and for accessing supports for managing one's health. Then you can look at commercial platforms and devices. So in this context, too, people do try to manage their health or disability-related needs independent of traditional healthcare providers through, for instance, commercial sleep apps, fitness trackers that analyze heart rate, body temperature, movement, voice tone, and talking during sleep, and also through mental health apps that in communities that are formed via social media to provide mental health support in lieu of more traditional therapy resources. Another example is wearables and that researchers have developed to monitor, for instance, heart rate, voice and skin temperature and movements that are all indicators of stress that can lead to outbursts in people with autism. So while this technology is intended to reduce the need for wellness checks or other kind of law enforcement interactions, it can also then reduce disabled people's agency by signaling to caretakers that there may be a need for intervention because stressors are heightening when, in fact, intervention is not necessary. And there are also IoT devices used in homes and in automobiles to control, for instance, the lighting in one's home, control the thermostat, to also control like home appliances and security systems through things like voice recognition and iris and facial and fingerprint scans. And these technologies can allow disabled people to depend less on others to manage and navigate the environment that they're in. But this data collection and data sharing and storage that is involved here also obligates people to accept this kind of a trade-off. Either you can benefit from the uses of these technologies, or you can protect your privacy, but you can't do both. So that kind of trade-off is independent living versus the risk of data exposure and misuse. And so these products, they can also enable access for other authorized users. They can also enable data sharing between interconnected devices that are developed by different companies and that therefore have different data policies that they're subject to. So they can also make it harder for people to then kind of track who and how their data is being used. And IoT devices have also been vulnerable to security lapses. So for instance, hackers have access to Amazon Ring and Google Nest devices in multiple incidents of harassment and abuse that have left people afraid to live alone, which is ironic considering that people are turning to these devices for home security purposes. Then in the hiring context, we have a few different examples of how biometric and behavioral data are used. For instance, HireVue has come under scrutiny over its use of facial and voice analysis in its recorded interview analysis software. So that kind of feature will capture vocal tics, facial expressions, movements, fidgeting, and all those are used to kind of gauge somebody's trustworthiness or their confidence or their enthusiasm. HireVue has explained in its AI explainability statement that it doesn't use video analysis or other audio characteristics, but it does still apply natural language processing to transcription developed through AI-driven speech-to-text services, which is then used to analyze personality traits and aptitudes. So that can end up capturing trends in the vocabulary usage or vocal tics that are being kind of captured in the transcription service that will then affect how that text is being analyzed down the road. Another example in the hiring context is Pymetrics' gamified assessment, which captures performance data as somebody's completing a set of games, as well as Tradeify's image-based personality assessments, which requires people to indicate basically their personality traits based on the images that they select, kind of indicating me or not me, or what they identify with a certain kind of idea being conveyed. So in these contexts, you're basically using how somebody speaks, how somebody moves, how somebody communicates, and what they're conveying to you about their tendencies and their aptitudes to make an assessment about whether they're worthy, essentially, of getting a job, rather than focusing on characteristics that are really essential for performing the core job functions. And so all these end up misusing biometric data and other data is intended to help infer somebody's potential behaviors if they were to get the job. This extends then also to the workplace management context. So here, a variety of different examples too. You have employers applying natural language processing to workers' interactions with customers to measure workers' perceived empathy and other emotional characteristics. You have tools that are used to track workers' location and their movements, how often and how frequently they take breaks, how long those breaks are, and also their keystrokes and their mouse movements and clicks to determine their productivity. So there you're really just monitoring how people are moving and where, when they are performing the job, rather than just focusing on whether they're getting the job done. And certain applications also collect health data to administer employee wellness programs that impose expectations around diet and exercise that not all workers will be able to meet, especially disabled workers. And employers use these programs to influence workers' behaviors and their health decisions in an attempt to increase their productivity and also to reduce their own costs when administering benefits. And both in the hiring context and in the worker management context, these tools are trained on and they function on this premise that only workers who behave a certain way, who work a certain way, and who communicate a certain way can perform their job functions as employers require. By using these measures of performance or productivity that can really vary based on disability, these tools may cause disabled people to be more prone to adverse decisions related to hiring, compensation, promotion, and disciplinary actions. Switching to the housing context, there's property management technology, where in addition to the more sophisticated facial recognition, you also have landlords capturing biometric data using just basic video surveillance. And in either case, landlords are using this data to detect unauthorized presence on their property and detect any behaviors that might endanger their property or other tenants. Retail establishments kind of do something similar, where they've explored, for instance, monitoring behavioral data to flag certain actions as shoplifting, for instance, of sudden movements or the way people are looking around. And these systems can flag disabled people based on their movements or behavior, and also may retain data about a flagged shopper's physical appearance so that if they return, they can be re-identified at that establishment, and that could then also be used to harass shoppers who are people of color. This can also trigger law enforcement involvement as well, usually needlessly, which potentially then can contribute to public records that incorrectly suggest criminality, but nevertheless can influence background checks, for instance, in the housing context. So all these varied uses, they build on a history of surveilling and criminalizing Black and brown people and disabled people's bodies and movements. And data-driven discrimination in any one of these areas will feed into systemic racism and ableism in other areas. So any given use of biometric data or behavioral data can really have widespread ramifications. And consumers are left with this burden of preventing their own data from being exploited, even when their data is used and shared in ways that are not aligned with how they want their data to be handled and that they cannot reasonably track. Consumers can't meet this burden when they're faced with these really dense privacy notices, but also this ever-expanding network of data sharing that would require customers to essentially find and dig through a variety of privacy policies to try and get a complete understanding of how and by whom their data is being repurposed. So for instance, you imagine you do one privacy policy, it lists a certain number of ad partners, and you try to go through each of those ad partners, see what their privacy policies are. You end up just with an unreasonable, unmanageable effort to try and track how your data is being used and how far it's extending. And data brokers further heighten the inherent risks in collecting and storing biometric behavioral data, from internet service providers to social media platforms to other commercial apps and devices. Data brokers can obtain location data and health data from countless sources. So for instance, dating apps like Grindr, where data sharing can endanger LGBTQ+ users, family safety apps like Life360, Muslim prayer apps that share location data, weather apps, mental health apps like Crisis Text Line, BetterHelp, and Talkspace that essentially commercialize people's mental health, and even mobile game apps. And I'm forced to really choose between getting the benefits of these data practices or avoiding these privacy risks, as I mentioned earlier. Marginalized communities can't afford to prioritize privacy when it's going to come at the expense of the benefits or opportunities that they're seeking to access in these technologies that are misusing their biometric data and their behavioral data. So with that, I'll stop there. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Before we go to questions, I just wanted to welcome up, I'm sorry, there you are, Wilmaria Scotto, if you want to come on up. Thank you so much for joining us. She is a policy analyst with Access Now, and she'll be able to speak on a lot of these things from an education standpoint as well, and how it's used in schools. So we can go to a couple questions and then go to Wilmari, and then we'll open it up to broader questions. But I think, Sophie, you have a quick one.
I was wondering if you would consider automated fall detection technology for monitoring the elderly or those who have like an unstable balance in the same category, because I have heard in recent years of many different ways that researchers propose to detect falls, from using the Wi-Fi network in a home to gait detection to wearables to sort of tell when someone falls, but those all involve forms of surveillance and the expectation that someone who is at risk of a fall would be okay accepting that kind of pervasive watching.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of example that demonstrates why you can't just kind of push for an overhaul of privacy without taking into account how it's going to affect and potentially limit the benefits that people are getting out of technologies like that. The elderly who have mobility issues may not have the option of opting out of that technology. That should not obligate them to accept any repurposing of their data for other purposes. They're choosing to make their data available for this explicit purpose to detect whether they may be in need of assistance, and that should really be the extent of it. That also should be subject to protections and limitations around how that data is then being retained and stored and reshared.
I have a follow-up question to that. I'm working on some stories right now where different researchers and I guess product makers are arguing that what they're doing is not privacy violating, and it's actually very similar where it's like a sensor. And so I guess my question is, when is it actually considered privacy violating? Like, what's the best standard there? If it's not actually, personally identifying information or sensitive information, is the fact that it is just capturing, in that example, like a fall, is that privacy violating, or is it when it then gets shared with someone else that the violation occurs?
I think it's largely when it goes beyond the scope of why that data has been provided in the first place. So if it's being used for anything other than detecting that fall and providing assistance to that person, then that's outside the scope of what that user is expecting when they choose to engage with that tool. It's beyond the scope of what is even necessary in order to ensure that technology maintains its functionality. So when it goes beyond that, then it's kind of cross that line and start into violate privacy. And things like sharing that data, those are just obvious crossing of that boundary. But anyway, even when it's not shared, when that company is repurposing it, for instance, in a separate context, the crisis text line example where their own spinoff was using the data they were collecting. It wasn't shared, but it's still repurposing the data for something that has nothing to do with the reason why people are using that service in the first place.
Yeah, just one thing I'll add. What companies do with the data after they acquired it, that's a major determination of privacy violation question that you address. And I think Ridhi did a wonderful, had a wonderful response to that. And I'd also just add, the consent aspect. If they don't know that they're being recorded or that their data is being collected, then that also falls within privacy violation frame. And I blanked on the second thing that I was going to say, but it was related to your last point. If it comes back to me, I'll address it. Sorry, folks.
No, but that's
the consent. I was going to say that the principles, right? So major data protection principles of data minimization and purpose limitation. That's what we also was getting to. So in any strong data protection framework, that those things should be included, and companies that are, those are things that they should be implementing, but they're not, even when they say they're going to. So I just want to add that there. I have some notes here on my laptop. Is it okay if I just pop it up there? And I prefer to stand, if that's okay with you all, because I'm a pacer. Hi, everyone. My name is Wilmaria Escoto, and I am a U.S. policy analyst and the data protection lead for Access Now. And I'm really excited to be here and talk with you today. First, I do want to give a small shout out and a thank you to the National Press Club for inviting me to join this discussion and to talk to you all about biometrics and how the use of biometrics really to infer our emotions and our gender and the harms that stem from that. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Access Now, you can look us up, but I'm going to give you a very short blurb. We're an international human rights organization. We fight to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk around the world. We have consultative status in the United Nations. We work in the LATAM region and the MENA region. I lead our North American data protection and privacy efforts, as well as our freedom of expression efforts. And we really promote data protection policies and laws through our different campaigns. So we have the Ban Biometric Surveillance campaign, which we have a really neat name for that. It's called Ban BS, because it's funny. And we've also partnered with organizations like All Out, which is an LGBT plus organization. And we really worked with them to highlight the harms from automated gender recognition systems and the use of AI systems to predict sexual orientation. So in the time that I have today, really, like, my goal is to talk to you a bit about these technologies that aren't really getting as much scrutiny, and to really maybe flag some things you didn't know, share some things you didn't know, maybe serve as a trigger for your creativity and writing and really be a resource after this. So really excited to talk to you about this. I'm going to try my best to summarize the major points because there's a lot I can get into. So for time's sake, I'm going to really try to hit the main points. And so with that being said, we'll just start. Biometric surveillance, commercial surveillance has become all-encompassing. Companies are able to track what we're doing, where we're at, who we're with. And we usually don't know, we don't give our consent, and we don't know what they're doing with that data, who they're selling it to. I'm sure you've heard so much about facial recognition technology over the past couple of years, but there's also other controversial technology that's seeping into our daily lives, which is what I really want to talk to you today about. And these technologies deserve greater scrutiny. So today I'll be focusing on emotion recognition technology and automated gender recognition technologies and how they suffer from fundamental flaws. And for those who don't know what emotion recognition technology, I'm just going to do like just a quick background for folks. So this is a tech that really covers it covers a range of technologies that claim to infer someone's emotional state from data that's collected about that person. It's been used in hiring for honesty and to determine honesty and enthusiasm, in airports to determine bad intent, and it's been used in education. And so emotion recognition technology itself, right, the systems, they really rely on this guy, Paul Ekman, it's kind of like the pioneer of this. And it relies on his controversial basic emotions theory, which really identifies about 6 basic emotions, right? So just a show of hands, because I didn't want to make this interactive. All right, so how many of you think that you express your emotions differently from anyone sitting next to you, beside you, in front of you, just from your culture? Do you think you express your emotions differently? For me, a Dominican Latina immigrant, right? Right? We can all kind of agree, like we probably express ourselves a little bit different, And so that main point right there is that, or I guess what I'm trying to say is the relationship between facial expressions and a person's emotional state is so much more complex than it appears, because people express their emotions differently across cultures, ethnicities, circumstances. And so for all of those who raised your hand, you were right. The University of Glasgow, I'm always worried I'm mispronouncing it. So their researchers actually found that culture does shape the perception of emotions. And then researchers from the University of Cambridge, they did a really cool, they created a really cool game. It's called Emojify. You can look it up, emojify.info. And so they designed this game, emojify.info. Sorry if I'm speaking a little too fast, you know how it is. So they designed this game that attempts to identify emotions from facial expressions when you have your video camera on your tablet or your computer. And what they found there is that the software's readings were far from accurate, and it actually over-exaggerated expressions. It often interpreted even exaggerated expressions as neutral. So what does that demonstrate? It demonstrates that this basic premise underlying much of the emotion recognition technology systems, that facial movements are intrinsically linked to changes in feeling, that's flawed, right? So there's also research out there demonstrating that this technology is racially biased. So we've seen a lot of that in facial recognition technology, right? And when it comes to ERT, emotion recognition technology, research is showing that the systems have trouble identifying faces of darker skinned people, right? So in one study, the system assigned more negative emotions to Black men's faces compared to white men's faces. It read Black men's faces as angrier than white men's faces, no matter their expression, right? So think about that. So it's kind of fair to say that this tech can have serious consequences for people of color, Black and brown communities, marginalized communities. And I was just going to give you like 2 quick examples, just kind of give an idea of how it's being used in education, because that's also really concerning. In China, ERT has been used by teachers to monitor students as they study at home and how they gauge how well they're doing their homework, how they respond to classwork. And so as they're studying, the system collects biometric information like the muscle joints on your face through the camera on the computer or the tablet. And then they attempt to identify emotions like happiness, sadness, anger, surprise. In the US, in April of this year, it was reported that Intel in classroom technologies, they sell a virtual software called Class. And so they partner together to integrate an AI-based technology that it would run on Zoom, and it claims to basically do the same thing that they're doing in China. It claims to assess students' facial expressions and determine if they're distracted, if they're bored, if they're confused, and it assesses these expressions and how they're interacting with educational content. So why does this matter, right? Why should you care? Simply put, in education, it could really further exacerbate inequalities and oppressive dynamics that we've seen for decades. It's common knowledge that Black students experience more suspensions, and other disciplinary actions than white students, often for the same behavior, right? So they're doing the same thing, but Black students are getting punished differently. And so there's another study that explores the racialized perception of emotions and bias among prospective teachers. And that concluded that teachers are more likely to interpret Black boys and girls' face expressions as angry even when they're not. You can kind of see how that can cause serious, serious damage, serious consequences to children at a very young age, how they're perceived, how much attention they're given, how teachers treat them. And so if racially biased ERT is deployed in these settings, it's in these problematic settings, and existing inequalities and oppressions could be magnified. This is a technology that makes inferences about your emotional state, and it's an intrusion into our private mental life. It erodes our right to privacy and freedom of thought. So when you think about the right to privacy, right, it includes the right to keep our thoughts and opinions private. You can tell a lot by a person's facial expressions at times, right, depending on their culture, their ethnicity. There are certain things you might be able to glean, and we deserve the right to not have our thoughts and opinions manipulated or judged. Or to be penalized for those thoughts and opinions, right? Students shouldn't be penalized for looking confused, should they? Or it's also been used in hiring. I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but so there's a particular risk to human rights that also occurs when ERT is used to detect whether protesters or potentially dangerous or aggressive protesters are going to commit an act when they haven't yet. So how are you going to determine whether someone's going to commit something like that? And it doesn't even matter if those inferences, like in such a case, it doesn't matter whether the inference is unreliable. The consequences of a wrongful arrest are real. In facial recognition technology, we already know that 3 Black men have been wrongly arrested. So think about that process: getting handcuffed, getting put in a police car, going to the station, getting fingerprinted, and knowing that it's all because of a system that wrongly misidentifies you, and you're innocent. And if you're a person of color, no one's probably going to believe you. So stop there before I go down a tangent. All right, and so there's also technology that aims to infer the gender of an individual, right, from data collected about them. And automated gender recognition, it uses your information like your legal name, the bone structures of your face, to infer your gender identity, and it really reduces it to a simplistic binary. So it fails to consider or reflect any objective or scientific understanding of gender. And it erases people who or it symbolizes an erasure essentially for people who are trans or non-binary. And then also, Black and transgender people are at a higher rate of misgendering. And I just had one in this subset. I kind of had just one little kind of case study or something that I wanted to share all with you. Spotify had a speech recognition patent that claimed to be able to detect your emotional state, your gender, your age, your accent, to be able to recommend music better. So in other words, it would use emotion recognition and gender recognition to make inferences about what emotion a person is experiencing and what gender they are to recommend a song. And so in 2021, we joined hundreds of human rights groups and recording artists and academics And we penned an open letter to Spotify requesting that the company not use their patented technology to listen to individuals' conversations and recommend content based on their emotions. According to that patent, the device would stay on all the time, and it would always be monitoring, processing your voice data, and collecting sensitive information. So that's another thing. These devices that are always on, they're collecting sensitive information about you. And in theory, it sounds cool, right? Oh, Spotify can recommend music to me. But there's an entire population that could disenfranchise or that could really harm. And so these technologies, when we're, in the past couple of years, we've just seen, right, techno solutions. Everyone wants to automate things and they think that it's going to make things better, but they're not doing the due diligence, considering the human rights impacts that it's going to have, or the subset of people that it's going to impact, or even engage in any type of public commentary with these communities. And so, there are numerous harms that can happen to LGBT plus people through the use of automated gender recognition. They could be interrogated by authorities at the airport if, like, let's say a system determines that you're not the gender that that's marked in your passport, or you could be prohibited from going to gender-specific spaces like a bathroom or a locker room. And authorities in repressive countries can analyze security camera footage or social media profiles to track down individuals that they believe are LGBT plus and arrest them. So, any solutions based on collecting huge amounts of biometric data, whether it's facial recognition, emotion recognition, automated gender recognition, and so much more that I didn't touch on today, to form mass surveillance and contribute to building a surveillance infrastructure really threatens our rights and freedoms, and it deserves greater scrutiny. And I'm sure Ridhi has spoken about this as well. We have very little transparency about the companies providing this technology for these solutions. And any type of rushed implementation really does undermine trust. And the way that biometrics have been adopted in other domains like policing, exam proctoring, hiring, has done a lot to undermine trust rather than build it. So I'll stop there. I think I'm at time about. Yeah, I'll open it up to any questions if folks have any questions. I also have some resources I'll be sharing with Anne to share with you, some reports, the Ban BS letter, the letter we sent to Spotify. We also partnered, earlier this year it was reported that Zoom was going to use ERP on sales calls. So we partnered together, joined a campaign led by Fight for the Future, urging Zoom to not adopt the technology in video conferencing software. So I'm happy to share those resources with you. There's just so much we're doing when it comes to government access to that as well, but I won't get into that. Digital identity, YID programs. So a lot to share there with you. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. But if you have any questions now, I'd love to hear that.
Hi, you mentioned transparency, and this is for anyone to answer, but it's related to, I guess, the transparency, or what I call the black box algorithm problem, in the sense that all this data is being collected mostly now by just algorithms and machine learning programs and models, and those of us in the room sort of know by now that there are many flaws and potential inequities built into these things that create sort of flawed models as an end result and have real material consequences for folks who have been historically discriminated in this country. And yet, when you go to companies and try to demand for some more transparency, let me see the algorithm and see what the problem is, because we're identifying these things at the end result. It'd be certainly better to kind of catch it in the model, but then they have their arguments for, this is our proprietary, we can't share this, we have our business concerns, et cetera, and I just wonder, both of you, in terms of policy analysts, how you kind of think about that particular thing.
Thank you, Daniel, right? Yes, that's a great question. You're absolutely right. They're always finessing their responses. They don't want to they don't want to tell us, and they use intellectual property, right, as kind of like a scapegoat many times, or as a shield. But And then and what came to mind as well was, you know, even when a lot of time these companies do these impact assessments, you'll look at it and it's red, and they still continue, they still move forward. So I think that's something personally, right? Just even my conversations with the DOJ or the OSTP or the Government of Accountability Office in the last couple of weeks, really thinking about how to drive impact. And that's something kind of across the board. I was just in a meeting with Senator Lujan's staff and Menendez staff and talking to them about some stuff. And, you know, it's like Congress can call you to a hearing, and there's all of this kind of, all these steps that happen, but then they still continue, right? There's a decree through through the FTC, and they violate it or the fine. So I think that's something that just kind of across the board, folks are really trying to figure out how to make them most accountable. But there's still a way to advocate for transparency kind of around that. I'll hand it to Ridhi if she wants to add anything. I hope I did that.
Absolutely. I would just add a couple of things. One, I think there's even a lower threshold of transparency that's not being met even before you get to the IP question. Like, for instance, HireVue had made available its report formed by an independent auditor, but you had to provide your email address and name and contact information in order to download that. That's like a basic degree of transparency you could readily provide to the public, but still it's kind of odd to be soliciting data in order to get access to how they kind of characterize their work as being more transparent, providing more transparency. That's kind of one example. In general, when you talk to these companies, their ability to even articulate why they needed to use certain data or what they were kind of designing for, the purpose they were designing for, that's always not always expressed either. So if you can't even do that much, like before you can even get to the point of true explainability of how your algorithm works, if you can't even kind of justify why you're using it in the first place, that's like a clear initial barrier that needs to be overcome. And then also when it comes to explainability, I think there are levels of explainability that will be useful depending on different audiences. So for the average user, you might not need all the details necessarily about how an algorithm is going to work. People really just want to know generally how their data is being treated and how what kind of outcomes they can expect. There may be a greater utility in more detailed data depending on whether the data kind of transparency is being provided to regulators versus advocates and policy experts that may be able to contextualize and analyze the reporting that's being provided about how an algorithm is working that users might not get that same kind of benefit out of. So that should also, I think, be a consideration too, like incorporating different levels of disclosure based on who is going to be utilizing that analysis of how the algorithm is supposed to be working and how well it's actually fulfilling that purpose. But I think there's like twofold, both talking about the more complicated question of how these algorithms are working, then also the more basic question of like, is it even justifiable and what kind of role is it playing in the overall ecosystem that's being used?
And I will just add one last comment that Ridhi touched on. These organizations aren't taking data minimization seriously, and they're collecting it without impunity and with impunity. And there was one study in Europe that showed companies in Europe, they gathered 72% gathered data that they didn't end up using. And another global report showed that 55% of all the data collected is dark data. So it's not used for any purpose after it's being collected. And that reasoning was clear, right? It's part of the business model. Organizations want as much data as they can to monetize it. In 2013, researchers studied 100 apps, and they found that 56 of them, including Angry Birds, brightest flashlight apps, they collected geolocation info that they had no business collecting. And even Pokemon Go, I remember when that was the fad a couple of years ago, it's the beginning of COVID field, they also failed to minimize their data collection. So as millions of people downloaded their app across the globe, they gave away access to their location and camera and granted access to their Google accounts. So companies are engaging in just expansive data collection. There's a lot of ways to kind of approach it, whether it's asking for various disclosures, more privacy impact assessments, human rights impact assessments, conversations, right, with civil society organizations, and just kind of having that that dialogue open. Does anyone have, was that good?
Have you seen any of this? Well, I feel like I've seen it improve. So I'm curious how, or if it is improved in your mind, and what we need to do to continue, or what you would like to see companies do. Because I mean, some of these things consumers want, some of the access people grant is for their own convenience. So I'd love to figure out, like, what should we be advocating for, asking about to drive it, make it better?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, transparency and minimizing the amount of data you're collecting is one thing. I think that there are these very fundamental data protection principles that would really help combat a lot of kind of the harms that we're seeing, because if companies don't have this data, then they can't use it against us. In regards to what I kind of see folks doing more, what we would like to see, or recommendations, or what to be advocating for, I would say that we would want any private companies that are developing or using facial recognition and remote biometric recognition technologies really to make public. So Access Now has taken a position that any of these remote biometric recognition technologies or facial recognition technologies that enable mass surveillance and discriminatory targeted surveillance should be banned. So that's one thing that we advocate for personally, is making public commitments to seize, creation, development, sale, and use of these technologies. We also call for transparency reports, right, that detail their public contracts, including ones that are suspended, ongoing, in the making for these previous technologies. And also to meaningfully engage with and refrain from retaliating against people that organize in a workplace to challenge or refuse the development of these technologies. We've also called on, I mean, one aspect of it as well is, like, how do I articulate this? Applying pressure on who's supplying funds, right? So investors and financial institutions, and calling on them to conduct human due diligence on the ongoing and future investments in companies that are selling these technologies when it's incompatible with human rights, or to call on these companies themselves to invest in what I mentioned earlier, stopping, creating, developing, selling, or making these technologies. So when it comes to facial recognition technology, for example, right, there's stuff that, like how you said, consumers are handing over their data, and right, how easy it is to open an iPhone or to go through security or all of these things. So there are some, it can get really into the nuances. There's facial detection, facial authentication, facial identification. So we've taken positions on certain things of that. And so I think it's really figuring out, kind of what your position is on each one. I digressed. Sorry, I don't know why I went into the facial. This is why I don't want to talk about facial recognition technology. It clouds my judgment. But summarize, I think calling on investors and financial institutions. I think that there should also be more unity and harmony among some civil society organizations. You see so many organizations working on similar topics, and a lot of the change in the push we see is when coalitions come together, and they drive things, like when with Amazon and them halting their facial recognition technology. So I think there are a lot of advocacy avenues you can go through. I'll think about that more, and I'll send you a letter response, Stacey.
Just to back off of your last point, also about, like, this kind of being a case-by-case determination about what your position will be depending on the particular use in the particular context. For instance, CDTB have supported a moratorium on, for instance, facial recognition used by law enforcement where the practice is not being improved. So generally, if there is a way to mitigate the harms that the practice is having, those need to be addressed. And if there isn't a way to do so until that improvement is made, they should be halted altogether. And for instance, if you think about like IDing earlier this year, there's a lot of attention to it. And on the one hand, with the facial recognition in ID's features to be implemented, it would pose pretty clear concerns for people who are going to be subject to false results from facing, for instance, how their skin color is being analyzed by facial recognition, whether it's being recognized and processed correctly. But on the other hand, there is also the question of if you were to get rid of the use of biometrics such as facial recognition to, for instance, access IRS or access another kind of account. What does that mean for people then who are kind of relying on the use facial images rather than other kinds of data that they may not be able to use because, for instance, they aren't able to kind of enter information manually or go to the possibility of traveling somewhere in order to be able to find alternative methods of providing the same kind of verification information. So in that case, you can't necessarily say to get rid of facial recognition or biometric data use altogether, but it needs to be scoped in a way that's going to minimize how that data is going to be repurposed or shared with someone else who may be abusing that use. And so we would stop short of calling for an outright ban in that context, but it does have to really take into account all the different impacts, positive and negative, of the technology, and make sure that the harms are not outweighing the purported benefits that are being promised to consumers. So it does really have to be evaluated based on how people in real time are being affected. Those who are kind of desperate for their benefits, who are relying on some kind of facial recognition or to access their account information that eventually allows them to access the information that they're looking for, they can't really wait for a better solution to be implemented. They kind of need whatever is going to work for them now. So it really needs to be about harm reduction in the immediate term. And then while that's happening, also be working towards a longer term.
I had a question about some of the ERT in schools that you mentioned. Is that something that has come in public schools or private schools? Because I feel like that's two different kind of sets. But I guess specifically within that, it was making me think of something like ADHD, which is already underdiagnosed in some groups versus others. I think much lower with women than with men, regardless of the incidence. And then kind of external socioeconomic factors that might affect attention in schools, whether or not you have enough to eat, or if there's like a domestic problem at home and things like that, and the kind of disparities that would kind of like layer on there. So is that some of the kind of issues that are there? I don't know. There's more that you could tell us about that. I'm curious of that.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. Sandra? Sandra. Oh, wonderful. So I don't have an answer for you. I need to double check. I don't think it actually said whether it was a private or public school, but that's a great question, and I want to kind of look into that a little bit more. I think it was public schools in China. I think that Intel and the classroom technologies partnership is also for public schools, but I'll double check. I don't know, and I don't want to misinform you. I haven't seen, there might be one, but I haven't seen an in-depth study about a conversation or that someone publishing something regarding ERT and ADHD. It is something that I've considered. It's about, thinking about the disabled community, like you said, challenges that you have at home, whether it could be anything from child abuse to not having enough food at your house and being distracted, or trauma in whatever form that is. So those are definitely things that I am thinking about, and I'll get back to you. I'll that's a really good question. So I'll definitely follow up with you on that. Thank you. I anticipate it'll be discussed more. There might be people working on that now. Ridhi, have you seen anything?
Well, we have considered the issue of
disabled.
not necessarily the intersection with biometric data, but certainly how you're using behavioral data and how it can inferences about human behavior. So, for instance, with early dropout warning systems or systems that are used to kind of provide an intervention for students who appear to be struggling in the academic setting, affected by the very factors that we're talking about, their health, their previous access to accommodations, how all of that is going to influence their ability to maintain attendance rates currently, how it's going to affect their grades and their exam performance. So like all of those kind of external factors aren't necessarily taken into consideration when you're talking about whether a student is, whether a student requires certain kind of supports within the school system setting. But it should be very much a consideration like when you're talking about whether that kind of a tool is actually going to be beneficial and going to address the factors that are contributing to poor attendance rates or contributing to exam scores that are suboptimal for that particular student. So it should definitely be a consideration.
So I have to cover a lot of, big tech congressional hearings. And I imagine when you sit down with these elected representatives that we send to Washington, you advocate for your positions and have a lot to say. How would you, yet what I've seen in my short time covering tech is that not very much happens after these hearings. What would you change about the people in the hearings, their staff, the design of the hearings, the people testifying about privacy, data security, national security? I'm going a little bit afield from what you're talking about because I've seen this theme. Yeah. What would you change about those hearings that would break through and get the public to care about it? Or is it our problem as reporters? Are we doing something wrong in how we're covering these big moments when we get to dive in?
No, I don't think it should just all be on you. I think that it could be broken down for normal, for people in layman's terms. That's a loaded question as to what, and I'm being recorded, so I'm going to be very careful. Yeah, let's do that. But I mean, for me, I think that one thing we've advocated for is like having, and the Tech Congress Fellowship has done a good job at that, having more people who know privacy and technology on staff, folks that can talk about these issues, that can get into the weeds of it, but then they can also kind of regurgitate that back. I believe I think it was made into a meme at a recent hearing when someone I can't remember which congressman or woman it was that didn't know what Facebook was or TikTok. I can't remember what that was, but see, everyone remembers, right? Because it was shocking. So situations like that, I think that for the public to really feel like change is being made or to really implement change, I think that we need to instill, a little more fear. These companies are really bold. They don't show up to the hearings sometimes. They don't respond to the questions. They don't care. And if they're being fined, they can pay it. Right? So what is the incentive? What is the punishment? How can you do that? So it is something that I'm still thinking through, but if I had to answer on the spot, hire more tech privacy staff. Basically, I can't remember right now.
Don't quote me on
that. So I think they can, but I can't remember. I think so. Don't quote me. So like have a heavier hand, and I think increase the fines. I'll talk to you more after this as well.
This conversation reminds me of a video game that was approved by the FDA a couple years ago to help build on the ADHD question. A video game that was approved to be prescribed to children suffering from ADHD as a clinical assessment tool, but also a prescription to hopefully relieve some of the symptoms. Is that a model that you see perhaps going forward when we talk about gamified assessment that could potentially work as a bridge between privacy and data and helping the end user, if there is a regulatory body that is involved to kind of instill a degree of trust with these kinds of gamified assessment tools?
I'm not familiar with what the study you're speaking to, so I'm going to speak very generally, and then I'll let Ridhi chip in. Sorry, let me get my thoughts together. in regards to a regulatory body, right, and someone who could instill trust, I mean, when it comes to data protection and privacy, I'm not sure if you were kind of leaning towards the FTC, that realm.
Is the FDA?
Yeah, so you were talking about the FDA. I don't have a comment on that, on opinion. I'm not as well versed, and I don't feel comfortable to speak on that. I don't know. What do you think?
Kind of looking at a parallel in the employment context, to take gamified assessments there. A big part of instilling trust, I think, is how you represent the results of the assessment that you're talking about. So for instance, if you're going to claim that the tool is going to be unbiased, it's going to be less biased, if you cannot articulate how you've tested that across different protected classes, then can you really claim that it's unbiased? And if you aren't communicating that, what expectation can you reasonably have about consumer trust in that tool? And as something talked about earlier, when you're talking about something like ADHD that can show up differently depending on your race and how you were socialized growing up, and how cultural factors have affected how your disability presents, can you articulate then how well that tool is going to assess ADHD for people who are mostly marginalized, who have ADHD and are also people of color, who have been kind of conditioned or socialized growing up to mask the manifestations of ADHD and other disabilities. For instance, just continuing with the ADHD thread, you think about like primarily inattentive versus primarily hyperactive ADHD, you hear that a lot. That can manifest differently depending on how people were raised and how they may have had to mask their symptoms of ADHD growing up. So hyperactivity might look different for different people too. Some of it might just be all internal. That doesn't necessarily manifest in ways that other people can easily perceive. So is this assessment going to work as accurately across different demographics, across different conditions that could affect those results? And if it can't perform accurately across the different conditions, then are you communicating that too? And just making it clear about the limitations of the assessment that you're proposing. So there could be potential beneficial uses to something like that in the healthcare context, or in the context of providing better resources for students if they can receive diagnosis earlier on in life to access the supports they would need. But it just needs to, I think, be honest about how much it really can do and how well it's going to work and how well it might end up falling short.
I think that was a great response. Your question went over my head for a second, but I think Ridhi hit all the main points there. And what are you saying about this technology, and is it true? Are you being deceptive? So that's something that the FTC has also started to dig into, right? Is these deceptive claims that these companies are making about their algorithm systems, or how they protect the data and the rights that people have, and that's tackled through their privacy policies. Like the Vermont State Attorney General filed a complaint against Clearview AI, and so the Vermont Consumer Protection Act is very similar to the FTC Act, and they go through a very interesting analysis of like the unfairness and then the deceptive claims that Clearview did on their privacy policies, and that's kind of what came to mind. But yes, with any technology, any AI system, right? We want to know what data is being used. How are you training the system? Are you being honest about its effectiveness, its accuracy? And are you informing, right, like consumers in a way that they understand? Yes, and that you're getting the consent you need from them, and children as well. So.
Hi. So a few months ago, I attended a biometrics industry conference, and they really have these talking points now, like, look at all these newness studies, like, we're so much more accurate now, like, there's so much hatred towards our technology, like, CBP was there, like, they're all like, okay, it's accurate now, we can use it. Obviously, a lot of that is probably not true. But, at what point, like, when a government agency or regulator is looking at this and weighing harms versus accuracy and, harms versus like the benefit for the masses, like what framework should they be using? Like, how do you decide, like, okay, this outweighs like the harms for the few to the benefits for the many? Like, do agencies even have that framework? Like, what would that look like?
I think, kind of just building off of what Mary just mentioned about the FTC's authority, that is very much a part of their own assessment in determining whether there has been a substantial injury. Like, how do you really quantify that? There, I think, traditionally has been a tendency to think of injury in terms of like financial impact, and if there hasn't been one, then what has the person really lost in the use of the tool? But I think we like to think more now about other trade-offs, like what else somebody might be paying with if it's not, a financial cost to the way that the practice is being implemented. So I think there's a need to kind of broaden beyond that really narrow focus of like, if we're, for instance, providing an app or a service for free, is it really so unfair to be using somebody's data because they are getting something without having to pay anything else for it? There is a trade-off there very much, and I think it's kind of disingenuous to claim that there isn't any kind of loss to a consumer if they're getting to use something for free when they are in fact giving something up very clearly, and they're giving something up that they cannot then kind of get back. You can't really trace how that data is going to be used down the road, and so therefore you might even be giving up more than you could anticipate at the moment that you're using a certain service. So I think it's just like a broadening of what means to injure somebody when you're inappropriate.
And some harms are so foreign, like with other, like deceptive interface designs and dark patterns. We partnered with the originator, Harry Brignall, and a few other organizations, and I think the Stanford adopted it now. So it was like a dark patterns tip line that would chart different types of harms. And, it can range, and I'm happy to share our comment to the White House Office of Science and Tech Policy on, it was the beginning of this year, I think, on biometric technologies, our comment. And there I explore the different types of harm, right? So it could be monetary loss. It could be, for elderly people as well, like embarrassment. It could be loss of privacy. That's a really basic one, but there's so many others that folks don't think about. And so I think that that's something to kind of keep an eye out for with FTC commercial surveillance comments, and kind of to see move forward and see how the FTC tackles that harm aspect. But we do see that argument all the time about, especially when it comes to facial recognition technology. And so if it was up to me, it's like if you know that this technology is damaging to a specific subset, just don't use it. It should be that simple, but it's not, because there's millions of dollars involved. And everyone has their own agenda at these companies. So I hope that answered your question.
We are over time, but thank you both so much. As has been the case with a lot of these discussions, it's both fascinating and frightening, but we really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise.
Thank you.